Number 10. Maxim Petrov. Maxim Petrov was convicted for the ending of 11 people's lives in St. Petersburg between 1999 and 2000. Maxim, nicknamed Dr. Death by the Russian media, was a practicing doctor who targeted patients from a local health center, ending their lives by giving them lethal injections at their homes, then robbing them. All victims were included on the same list of lung patients who had undergone fluorography. Using this list, the police identified 72 possible future victims in an operation called Medbrat, male nurse, involving 700 police officers. They arrested Maxim when he visited one of the patients on January 17th in the year 2000. On his arrest, Maxim admitted to the deaths but recanted his confession a few months later, blaming it on the intense psychological pressure he had endured while in custody. Various possessions stolen from the victims were later found in his flat, though he had already sold others at the market. He was suspected of ending the lives of 19 people, but tried for just 17. In 2002, Maxim was found guilty of 11 and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Number 9. Luka Magnotta. The name Luka Magnotta may sound familiar to some. Have you ever seen the Netflix documentary Don't F with Cats? Because if you have, this is where he's from. Luka took the life of Yun Lin, a university student in Montreal, Canada, in May 2012. After Luka ended his life, he then began to mail one's body parts to schools and federal political party offices. Then a video depicting the crime was posted online and Luka fled Canada, becoming the subject of an Interpol red notice and prompting an international manhunt. In June 2012, he was arrested in an internet cafe in Berlin where he was caught Googling himself. He also was previously sought out by animal rights groups for uploading videos of himself ending the lives of kittens. In December 2014, after 8 days of deliberations, a jury convicted him of his crime and was given a mandatory life sentence and 19 years for other charges to be served concurrently. He is currently at Port Cartier prison in Quebec. Number 8. Rosemary West. Rosemary West collaborated with her husband Fred West in the torture and the ending of lives of at least 9 women between 1973 and 1987. Rosemary also ended the life of her stepdaughter Charmaine in 1971. After police found human remains and apparent signs of torture at 25 Cromwell Street, Rose, along with Fred, were arrested in February 1994. During her trial, Rose denied ending the lives of any of the victims. Rose told the jury that her husband committed the criminal acts alone and she denied participating. In 1995, Rose was sentenced to life in prison while her husband ended his life before going to trial. She was found guilty of all 10 counts and was sentenced to life imprisonment, and it was emphasized that she should never be paroled. The Lord Chief Justice later decided that she should spend at least 25 years in prison, but in July 1997, Home Secretary Jack Straw subjected Rose to live out the rest of her life in jail. She's currently being held at HM Prison, Newhall in West Yorkshire. Number 7. Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader, aka BTK, an abbreviation he gave himself for bind, torture, and kill, ended the lives of 10 people between the years of 1974 and 1991 in Wichita and Park City, Kansas. He didn't just end lives, but also stalked women, and 2 women he stalked in the 1980s and one whom he stopped in the mid-1990s filed restraining orders against him. He also sent taunting letters to police and media outlets describing the details of his crimes. By 2004, the investigation of BTK was considered a cold case. Then, after a decade-long hiatus, Dennis initiated a series of 11 communications to the local media. This activity led directly to his arrest in February 2005. He pled guilty and was sentenced in 2005 to 10 life sentences, and though he's eligible for parole, it won't be until he's served at least 175 years. He is currently at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. Number 6. David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, aka Son of Sam, went on a spree of ending lives with his firearm many times in New York that started in July 1976. He ended the lives of 6 people and wounded 7 others by July 1977, terrorizing New Yorkers and gaining worldwide notoriety. David eluded the biggest police manhunt in the city's history while leaving letters that mocked the police and promised future crimes, which were highly publicized by the press. David was arrested on August 10, 1977 1977 and subsequently indicted for 8 crimes that ended lives. He confessed to all of them and initially claimed to have been obeying orders of a demon manifested in the form of a dog belonging to his neighbor, Sam. After being found mentally competent to stand trial, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences in state prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. He then admitted that the dog and devil story was a hoax, which is shocking. Intense media coverage of the case made David a celebrity, and he seemed to enjoy it. In response, the New York State legislature enacted new statutes known popularly as Son of Sam laws, designed to keep criminals from financially profiting from the publicity created by their crimes. The statutes have remained in law in New York State despite various legal changes, and similar laws have been enacted in several other states. David is currently at Shagum Correctional Facility in New York. Number 5. Charles Cullen. Charles Cullen was a nurse who ended the lives of dozens of patients during a 16-year career spanning several New Jersey medical centers until being arrested in 2003. He confessed to committing as many as 40 deaths, at least 29 of which have been confirmed, though through interviews with the police, psychiatrists, and journalists suggest he committed many more, as some experts believe he has up to 400 victims. On March 10, 2006, Charles was brought into the courtroom of Lehigh County President Judge William H. Platt for a sentencing hearing. Charles, upset with the judge, kept repeating, "Your Honor, you need to step down," for 30 minutes until Judge Platt had Charles gagged with a cloth and duct tape. Even after being gagged, Charles continued to repeat the phrase. In the hearing, Judge Platt gave him an additional 6 life sentences. As part of his plea agreement, Charles has been working with law enforcement officials to identify additional victims. He was sentenced to 11 life sentences in 2006 and will not be eligible for parole until 2403. He is currently located at New Jersey State Prison in New Jersey. Number 4. Paul Bernardo. Paul Bernardo committed crimes together with his former wife Karla Homolka, who were nicknamed the Ken and Barbie Killers. He is known initially for taking advantage of people in Scarborough, Ontario, a suburb of Toronto, between 1987 and 1990, before ending the lives of 3 women with Karla. Among those victims was Karla's younger sister, Tammy Homolka. Karla took a plea bargain of 12 years imprisonment, and she began giving statements to investigators. She told police that Paul had boasted that he had taken advantage of as many as 30 women, twice as many as the police suspected. This plea bargain caused a lot of outrage and was seen as controversial. Karla was released from prison in 2005, and she settled in Quebec, where she married the brother of her lawyer, where she's rumored to still be today. But now, after Paul's capture and conviction, he was sentenced to life imprisonment and was later declared a dangerous offender, thus making it unlikely that he will ever be released from prison. Following his conviction, Paul confessed to taking advantage of 10 more victims, and he is currently being held at Millhaven Institution in Ontario, Canada. Number 3. Joseph James D'Angelo. Joseph James D'Angelo, aka the Golden State Killer, was a former police officer who ended the lives of 13 people, took advantage of 50 people, and had been involved in 120 burglaries in California between 1974 and 1986. He is responsible for at least 3 separate crime sprees throughout the state, each of which spawned a different nickname in the press before it became evident that they were committed by the same person. He was also linked to hundreds of incidents of thefts, burglaries, vandalism, peeping, stalking, and prowling. He wasn't arrested until 2018 though, when DNA tracing from family members on genealogy sites linked him to his crime. In June 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 deaths and 13 counts of taking advantage of people. In August of that same year, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He's currently serving time at Corcoran Prison in California. Number 2. Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, aka the Green River Killer, was initially convicted of 48 separate deaths. As part of his plea bargain, another conviction was added, bringing the total number of convictions to 49. He ended the lives of women in the US state of Washington during the 1980s and 1990s. Now, most of Gary's victims were alleged to be sex workers and other women in vulnerable circumstances, including runaways. The press gave him his nickname after the first 5 victims were found in the Green River before his identity was known. He strangled his victims, usually by hand, and after strangling them, he would dump their bodies in forested and overgrown areas in King County, often returning to the bodies to take advantage of them. On November 30th, 2001, Gary was arrested for the deaths of 4 women whose cases were linked to him through DNA profiling evidence. As part of a plea bargain wherein he agreed to disclose the location of still missing women, he was spared the death penalty. He was sentenced to 48 life sentences with no possibility of parole, an additional life sentence, and 480 more years of tampering with evidence. He is currently at Washington State Penitentiary in Washington State. And coming in at number 1 is Robert Pickton. Robert Pickton worked full-time at his family's pig farm after inheriting it in the early 1980s. It was at this point that it was believed he started ending people's lives. He ended their lives just like they were pigs. When he was done with their bodies, he would then feed them to his pigs to get rid of the evidence, which is just messed up. He was finally arrested in 2002 and was convicted in 2007 for the deaths of 6 women and also the subject of a lengthy investigation that yielded evidence of numerous other deaths. Robert was charged with the deaths of an additional 20 women, many of them from Vancouver's downtown east side, but the charges were stayed by the Crown in 2010. Robert was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the longest possible sentence for second-degree murder under Canadian law at the time he was sentenced. The conviction was appealed twice by his lawyers, but ultimately rejected by Canada's Supreme Court. During the trial's first day of jury evidence, the Crown stated that Robert had confessed to 49 deaths to an undercover agent from the Office of Inspector General who was posing as a cellmate. The Crown reported that he told the officer that he wanted to end the life of another woman to make it an even 50, and that he was caught because he was sloppy. There was actually a 2-part episode inspired by Robert on the popular crime drama Criminal Minds for the season 4 finale called To Hell and Back. Well, that's all for our list of the top 10 terrifying prisoners we need to forget in solitary confinement. These people definitely need to stay there forever. They're terrifying.
Number 10, we have Cesar Villa's essay. Cesar Villa was a prisoner in a California penitentiary, and after some of the guards declared that he was a gang member, they decided that it was time to lock him away in solitary confinement for an unknown amount of time. After he was released, he wrote an essay about what it felt like going through that torment. He spoke about how the first 3 weeks he slowly started to see himself slipping, and the isolation sucked. By the end of the first year, he talked about how he was extensively exposed to the cold, which caused his hands and feet to split open, and he was bleeding constantly, but he was never given any sort of bandages to cover up his wounds because resources like this are not permitted. After 3 years locked away in a box, he said that his psyche started to fade. When he looked back at that moment, he can pinpoint that as the moment where he knew that would change forever. He struggled to keep his mind focused and his memory started to feel like jumbled mess. It's a wild essay to read, and it gives you first-hand insight what it was like to go through such an isolation, being in isolation in a solitary confinement. Number 9, not everyone's a monster. Alright, let's continue on this list of the dark solitary confinement stories. At number 9, we have not everyone's a monster. Their perspective on the other side can let us know that not even the guards like what's happening in these prisons. A corrections officer posted on Reddit about how watching inmates get forced into solitary confinement was the worst part of his job. You can see people break, and it was disgusting to see. The corrections officers didn't want to see the inmates hurt or tormented. They just wanted to come in and do their job and just leave without being harmed or seeing the inmates and convicts harmed. This Reddit poster talked about a particular incident where a warden forced someone to stay in solitary confinement for a minor offense. They were shoved into a room that had no bed, and there was literally just a shower. They stayed there for 3 days and started to self-harm because they just couldn't take it. They were going crazy. The person was removed, and afterwards the warden was fired. So before you get into number 8, make sure you guys hit the like button because it really helps us out. It really helps us out with the algorithms. It gets us recommended to you guys. Our number 8, we have William Blake. Well, William Blake has been in solitary confinement for over 25 years and he's still surviving there. Is this real life right now? 25 years of anything is way too long. He continues to write about his experience stuck in his cell in an article titled "A Sentence Worse Than Death." He talks about feeling loneliness and boredom that seem to be so powerful they have a physical effect on his body, like a pressure just seeping in. Every day in solitary confinement was like a constant battle to hold on to your own psyche. He has seen many men lose the battle with the box, have their minds slip away, and slowly but surely go insane from the pressure of being alone every day, all day for years at a time. But he said what is even worse than that is when the guards walk into a cell and they find a man hanging from the ceiling. Very tragic. Many of the people that are forced into solitary confinement aren't going to make it to the point where they are released or lose their mind. They're gonna end up suffering on their own terms. Number 7, Reddit confession. Reddit user Jesus broke down what their experience in solitary confinement was, about how they felt as if they're going insane from being forced to stay in the same cell for who knows how long. The lights in the cell were kept on all the time. There was never an escape from the glow shining down on him, confusing his mind to what day it was, because he doesn't know when it's nighttime. It's always daytime for him. It's always the same day for him. Thankfully, our Reddit user had a bulletproof window that he can look outside if he stood on his toes. So he needs to go up there, which means, that's the only time he can actually see out. This was his only connection with the outside world. It's pretty sad if you asked me. And moving right along, just like that, at number 6, we have agoraphobia. I didn't even know that this was a thing. I mean, I don't know about a lot of these phobias that I've been reading about. Well, this article that I was reading is from the Marshall Project. It's an interview with a prisoner who was in solitary confinement for 22 years. Agoraphobia is basically the opposite of claustrophobia, when people must be in smaller spaces or they start to have panic attacks. The prisoner said that the last 5 years of his time in solitary confinement, he didn't leave his cell, like, at all. Could you guys imagine that? I can't imagine that at all. When he was first locked away in solitary, he would leave his cell to go to the yard and exercise, but one day that all changed. He stepped out and it felt like the air around him was just crushing him, like his heart was going to explode. He smashed on the door until they opened it, and when the door opened, he wasn't running out of his cell, he was running in his cell. The guards would sometimes use this to aggravate him. They would threaten to pull him out of his cell. I mean, this is really sad. Is this real life right now? This shouldn't be a fear to be outside of your cell. This guy just can't handle freedom at all. He would lay in his cell and make up an imaginary life for himself. He would picture himself going on dates, getting married, raising children, an entire fantasy life all inside of his mind. Something to provide him with joy while being too afraid to leave the box. Number 5.
I probably did like 17 years, 18 years in segregation. And I did long stretches. There were short times, but the longest one was 10 years.
Well, that was Danny, aka Beast. 2 separate prison sentences, a 24 and a 16 split. First locked up in 1977, he spent 10 straight years in solitary, but that wasn't the only time. He was in and out of segregation throughout the entirety of his 2 prison sentences. He is one of the lucky ones who got out and back into society, and now he's partnered with a YouTube channel after prison where his life showcased and dissected his regard to his haunting experiences.
I was having trouble mentally in dealing with segregation for so long.
Number 4, Ashley Smith.
Stay still, Ashley. Thank you. You got any more then?
Okay, so this one hits close to home. Being from, well, Toronto, Canada, where we film right now, just a short drive away, Kitchener, Ontario, Canada, Ashley Smith committed suicide by strangling herself to death while prison guards watched and videotaped. Yet, they did not stop her. She did this because she was placed in solitary confinement for 1,047 days. That's just over 3 years. Although Ashley had reportedly suffered from mental illnesses, her case was fought and ultimately her death was ruled as a homicide, not a suicide. I totally would agree with that, because the sheer negligence of those that watched her and didn't try to save her. Hopefully those people just feel awful about themselves, and I hope they get to see the inside of solitary confinement. Keith Lamar comes in at number 3. Keith Lamar was only a teenager when he was in prison for killing someone and missed a drug deal gone wrong. A few years later, he was moved into solitary confinement where he stayed for 27 years. He wasn't even able to go outside in that time. The closest thing he had ever to go outside was the open air underground, a rat cage, which is this metal confinement they use for recreational. Fortunately, he does have some belongings in his 6x10 cell. To quote him, he said, "I've been lucky in a lot of ways. My cell has a bookshelf with 3 shelves, and there is a table to sit and write. I have a lot of music and books to read, not to distract myself from myself, but to take deeper into myself. I paint, I work out, I do yoga, I meditate. I meditate for an article written recently about how to handle quarantine and being alone during 2020 COVID pandemic." He is still currently serving a sentence and is waiting execution in 2023. So in at number 2, we have another dark story told. This story said, "I've been on a roller coaster up and down. I really had some bad times, some bad thoughts. You just start thinking along lines of maybe this is it. Maybe this is how I'm going to end. Suicide is probably one of the main things down here." And he also said, "I'm pretty much going through that. I was going to end my life. I don't think I can do do it. I don't think I can stay down here in the hole that long. Well, this was a direct quote from Richard Wolff, a man who experienced 640 days in solitary confinement. His brother is shown holding a photo of Richard, who died in prison when he collapsed in the exercise yard. And this is during the 1 hour a day he was allowed outside due to underlying heart conditions that were never met with appropriate medical attention. And we have Albert Woodfox at number 1. We've talked about him many times. Well, this right here is Albert Woodfox. Well, he was kept in solitary confinement for, okay, wait for it, you guys won't believe it. You're never gonna believe how long he did, not just in prison, but in solitary confinement. Well, if your guess was 43 years, you would be correct. He was first placed in there when he was accused of murdering a prison guard, something he denies to this day and believes that he was framed or there was funny business going on. The prison had no viable reason to keep him in a 6 foot by 9 foot concrete box by himself for that long, but they did, allowing Albert only 1 hour of solo yard time a day while he remained shackled. So you're in a cage outside for an hour, but yet you still have to be shackled. In the last year of prison, they cut that down to just 3 hours a week. I'm blown away by how absolutely awful this is. That poor man is finally out of prison and he's in his early 70s. Imagine being there for a crime you never committed.
Starting off this countdown, we have Charles Victor Thompson. On April 30th, 1998, Charles Victor Thompson got in an argument with his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend. This argument left them both dead. As a result, he was sentenced to the death penalty. While waiting on death row, Charles actually managed to escape. In 2005, Charles escaped and spent 3 days on the run until he was found drunk at a payphone. He was then recaptured and placed into solitary confinement, where he waits until the day he receives the death penalty. Moving on at number 9, we have Charles Bronson. Charles Bronson was an English criminal who gained the title the most violent prisoner in Britain and Britain's most notorious prisoner. He was first arrested for armed robbery and served a 7-year sentence. Upon his release, he had a career in bare-knuckle boxing. Then, in 1988, he was convicted of conspiracy to commit another robbery. However, this time when he went back to jail, he became a more violent inmate. In fact, there were multiple times where he took inmates as hostages. He would even often fight guards and fellow prisoners. As a result, he was moved 120 times. That's right, you heard me correctly. Nowadays, he spends his time in solitary confinement, which he will probably remain until his death. In our 8th spot, we have Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, otherwise known as the Green River Killer, was responsible for the murder of 48 women between 1980 and 1990. However, it's believed that he may have killed as many as 71 people. He then would dump the bodies along riverbanks in South King County, giving him the name the Green River Killer. He was arrested in 2001 and given 48 life sentences. Since his conviction, Ridgway has lived in virtual isolation. He was initially going to receive the death penalty, but ended up trading information about his murders to get out of it. But even in solitary confinement, people still considered him a big threat. They feared that he was studying his surroundings and looking for weaknesses, planning to attack or to find a way out. In our 7th spot, we have Ivan Millay. Ivan Millay is considered Australia's most notorious serial killer. Between 1989 to 1993, Millay murdered 7 backpackers. He would pick them up off the side of the road, torture, kill, and then bury their bodies. As a result, he was given 7 life sentences. He spent these sentences in solitary confinement at Goulburn Supermax Prison. Prison officers say that on multiple occasions, Millay would try to escape. He would often bust his head open by banging it on his cell's wall so that he would get an external visit to the hospital and then try to escape from there. Another time he swallowed metal to get a trip to the hospital, and even once he tried to cut off his finger. He was considered a highly manipulative inmate with a high risk of self-harm. Millay spent 18 years in Supermax prison before he died of esophagus and stomach cancer. Moving on to number 6, we have Michael Swango. Michael Swango, aka the serial killer physician, poisoned over 60 of his patients, though he only admitted to causing 4 deaths. Michael Swango worked at multiple hospitals. at the first hospital, nurses began to become suspicious of him after healthy patients would mysteriously die. One nurse even caught him injecting medicine into a patient who then became ill. Michael then bounced around from hospitals, poisoning patients' food with arsenic or other poisons, or he would kill the patients by overdose of whichever drug the patient had been prescribed. In 2000, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole. He is currently serving this sentence at the ADX Florence Supermax prison. There, he is confined to a 12 by 7 foot concrete cell. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Richard Lee McNair. Richard Lee McNair received 2 life sentences after being convicted of murder, attempted murder, and burglary. In 1987, McNair murdered 1 man and shot a 2nd man 4 times during a robbery that went wrong. He is currently in ADX Florence in solitary confinement. Now, here's the thing. Richard managed to escape prison 3 different times. The first time was in 1988 when he used lip balm as a lubricant to slide his handcuffs off. Then in 1992 he escaped again. And in 2006, he escaped for the last time by mailing himself out of prison. As a result, that's why he was placed into Supermax prison and in solitary confinement. But to this day, he's known as a master escapist. Making our way down the list at number 4, we have Robert P. Hansen. Robert Hansen was an FBI agent that sold thousands of classified documents to the Soviet and Russian intelligences. These documents outlined US strategies with regards to nuclear wars, exposed developments in the military's weapons, and detailed aspects of US counterintelligence programs. His espionage was considered as possibly the worst intelligence disaster in US history. Robert pleaded guilty to 14 counts of espionage and 1 conspiracy to commit espionage. As a result, he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. He is now serving his time at the ADX Florence, where he is in solitary confinement. Now, the reason why he's in solitary confinement is because he knows way too much about highly classified materials. Therefore, he is locked away to prevent any of this information from getting further leaked. Robert will be in confinement until the day he dies. Coming in at number 3, we have Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo, otherwise known as the Butcher of Rostov or the Rostov Ripper, was responsible for the deaths of 56 individuals. He would lure people that he met at bus stops or train stations away to remote locations where he would then murder them. He also had cannibalistic tendencies and would eat certain parts of his victims. In 1990, he was finally caught for these heinous crimes. In fact, when he was arrested, he said that he couldn't live without murder. He compared it to a first love, calling it unforgettable. Andrei spent 2 years in solitary confinement awaiting his death penalty in 1994. Coming in at number 2, we have Ed Kemper. Ed Kemper, also known as Big Ed, is an American serial killer who killed 10 individuals. It all started back in 1964 when Ed killed his grandparents at the age of 15. He claimed that he killed them just to see what it felt like. As a result, he was locked away for 5 years. In 1969, he was released at the age of 21. But he didn't learn his lesson because he went on to murder 8 more individuals, one of them being his own mother. Eventually, he was convicted again and is now placed in solitary confinement. Ed is only allowed an hour of recreation a day and 3 showers every week. But Ed is apparently okay with this, since he said that he is happier in prison than he ever was as a free man. While in prison, he got the name Big Ed since he weighs around 300 pounds and is 6'9". This dude is massive. I don't know how he fits in that cell. And in our number 1 spot, we have Martin Bryant. Martin Bryant is responsible for one of the world's deadliest shooting sprees in Australia. He took the lives of 35 innocent individuals and injured 23 others. He was given 35 life sentences with no opportunity for parole. For the first 8 months in jail, he was held in a specially built suicide prevention cell. But now he is in solitary confinement. Back in 2010, a reporter visited Bryant and claimed, and I quote,
Bryant lives the most hideous existence imaginable. He is in solitary confinement, grossly obese, and not allowed to see anyone except immediate family. Apparently, because he is suicidal, he is often drugged up so that he won't harm himself. The reporter also stated that he was placed in solitary confinement because he loves hearing about himself and what he did. So solitary confinement is a way to deprive him of this.
Starting our list off at number 10, Daniel Chong. The 25-year-old UCSD student was detained the morning of April 21st, 2012 while visiting a friend's house. Turns out the house was suspected of being a distribution center for narcotics, and when DEA agents stormed the residence, they found exactly what they were suspecting. Detaining a total of 9 people and seizing thousands of pills, both prescription and recreational, as well as tons of guns and ammo, it seems Chong was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He genuinely had no clue about any of the business taking place, and when he was detained, they threw him in a cell without charging him and actually forgetting about him for days. Being held in a 5 by 10 foot cell with no toilet, a pee hole through the door, and a metal bench, Chong was literally kicking and screaming for someone while handcuffed and fighting for his life. Even though he heard footsteps and voices from nearby cells, no one came to check on the innocent man until April 25th. By then, Chong had already drunk his own urine and caved "sorry mom" into his arm using shards of glass from his glasses, a way of giving her a final goodbye. Thankfully, he was released and never charged, but would end up losing 15 pounds and suffered from PTSD. Chong would go on to sue the DEA and would settle with a deal seeing the man receive $4.1 million from the agency.
Coming in at number 9 is Frank De Palma. On the 3rd of February 1992, Frank was sent to solitary confinement just so he could be kept away from the young gang members arriving at the Eli Maximum Security Prison. He was in prison for 42 years and 9 months, and he spent 22 of those in solitary confinement. Frank said he never once stepped out of his cell in the last 5 years of it. It got to a point that anytime he was taken into the yard, he started to panic because of all the open space and wouldn't be fine again until he was back in his cell. Frank developed agoraphobia. He started to divorce himself from all the people he used to know and the memories he had and started living in an imaginary world. On the 11th of March 2014, a warden and psychologist visited him because they realized he would be released soon, otherwise he was 100% sure they had forgotten he was even in there. By the time he was finally moved to another correctional center, Frank said he couldn't feel anything, he couldn't even speak since he hadn't done so in so long, and it actually took him a total of 7 hours just to come out of his cell. He was finally released on the 21st of December 2018.
Now on to number 8, Albert Woodfox. This man would serve more than 40 years in solitary confinement for a murder he says he didn't commit. In fact, Woodfox believes he was framed for the murder of a prison guard simply because he was a part of the Black Panther political party. Originally arrested in 1971 at just 22 years old for armed robbery, Woodfox would be sentenced to 50 years in Angola prison, which was at the time known for being one of the worst in North America. That's where he joined the Black Panthers, as he recalls the disgusting conditions the prison allowed and wanted to make a change. Unfortunately, he would be accused of murdering a guard named Brent Miller in 1972, along with fellow inmate Herman Wallace, even though there was no physical evidence linking the men to the crime. Aside from this, his conviction of the murder would be overturned twice, and finally in 2016, after accepting a plea deal to lesser charges, he would be released. To this day, the man is maintaining his innocence and made it clear that him accepting the deal wasn't an admission to guilt, but cited his age and health as the reason behind his decision.
Sliding into our number 7 slot is Robert King. Robert and Albert, who Jared just mentioned, were part of the Angola 3 along with Herman Wallace. They were put in solitary confinement at Angola prison for decades. Robert was initially incarcerated for armed robbery. While in prison, he was convicted of a prison murder back in 1973 and was put in solitary confinement for 29 years before his conviction was overturned. So of the 32 full years he spent in jail, only 3 of them weren't in solitude. In 2001, a new trial was ordered for his case and he was indicted yet again, but King decided to accept a plea deal for lower charges instead of serving more time. He was released the following year.
Now on to number 6, Steven Slevin. After being charged with drunk driving, New Mexico officials put Slevin in solitary confinement because of his history with mental illness, as per an official lawsuit. After spending 22 months in a cell all alone, Slevin was released and would go on to sue New Mexico, being awarded $15.5 million. As per the lawsuit, Slevin went to jail when he was 59 in 2005 and was well nourished and a physically healthy adult. However, as per reports, when he was released, he had a long beard, bed sores, bad teeth, and weighed just 133 pounds in June of 2007. Slevin wasn't even charged or prosecuted with his drunk driving and stolen vehicle charges, and as as per his civil rights attorney, Matthew Coit, I quote, "They threw him in solitary and then ignored him. He disappeared into delirium, and his mental illness was made worse by being isolated from human contact and a lack of medical care. At one point, it's believed he had to pull his own rotting tooth and that all his pleas for help were ignored."
Coming in at number 5 is Adam Capay. 23-year-old First Nations man Adam Capay was moved to solitary confinement back in 2012 after killing another inmate during a fight. Adam is in this plexiglass-lined cell at Thunder Bay Jail for 24 hours a day, just rotting under the artificial light. He spent 4 years in isolation, but the Community Safety Minister David Orazietti refuses to let him join the rest of the prison again. Adam's been alone for 4 years and still hasn't had his trial yet, which is ridiculous. He is one example of the thousands of prisoners in Ontario that spend more than 2 weeks in solitary confinement and get forgotten about. His case actually came to light after a prison guard tipped off the head of Ontario's Human Rights Commission, Renu Mandhane. She went to visit the jail and found him alone in the corner of his room after being in there for nearly 1,500 days. He had major memory loss, he couldn't speak, and because of the fake light, he couldn't tell when it was night or day. Mr. Orazietti still refused to release him even after her pleas.
On to number 4, Jerry Hartfield. In 1976, Hartfield was arrested after his fingerprints were found on a Dr. Pepper bottle located where a woman was assaulted and murdered. Although he confessed to the crime, he admits he was coerced into doing so, and given the fact that he was a black man in the South in the 70s with an IQ of 50 or 60, well, let's just say he wasn't given much of a chance from the start. It wouldn't be long before he would be sentenced to death. However, 4 years later, he would be requested to have a retrial after one of the jurors' issues with the death penalty was overlooked. Instead of giving the man a retrial, prosecutors in Texas tried to change his sentence to a life sentence, but after 3 years he would be issued a retrial. Prior to this, however, the governor decided he would change the sentence himself, avoiding a trial. The judges pushing for a retrial thought the prosecution was taking over from that point, and the governor's office thought the case was closed. In a sense, everyone thought someone else was handling the case, but that just led to a lot of miscommunication and years of Hartfield's life that he spent in prison. In 2006, he realized someone made a mistake after 23 more years locked up and decided to do something about it. When all was said and done, the state tried blaming Hartfield for not bringing their mistake to light from 1983 until 2006. However, from 2006 until 2013, when he pushed for a review of his case, his lawyers made a strong enough case that the state agreed with, claiming his speedy trial rights had been violated. This led to his release only after his lawyers appealed the court's initial decision in 2015 to sentence him to life in prison for a crime he seemingly didn't even commit.
Coming in at number 3, we have Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer. This monster of a man was convicted of 49 separate murders. His victims consisted of women of all ages, most being sex workers. He would strangle and dump their bodies in forested areas before coming back later on and having intercourse with their dead bodies. In November of 2001, Gary was arrested at work for murdering these women nearly 20 years prior. He was sentenced to 48 life sentences with no possibilities of parole, and 1 life sentence on top of that. A further 10 years was added since he tampered with evidence, making his total time 480 years on top of the 48 life sentences he already had. That's like so many people's lifetimes. In January of 2004, he was moved to solitary confinement at Washington State Penitentiary, and that's where he still is.
On to number 2, Destiny Hoffman. Originally supposed to serve just 48 hours total in jail, Hoffman would end up spending 154 days there after a judge seemingly forgot to issue her release order. On August 22nd, Clark County Circuit Court Judge Jerry Jacoby ordered Hoffman to be held without bond until further order of the court. The only issue is he totally forgot about that order until 5 months later. Apparently she was jailed without legal counsel or a hearing, which, as far as I'm concerned, is against her rights as an American. She was arrested after diluting her drug test, which was a violation of her original court order program. No one is sure why she didn't speak up about her sentence exceeding the 48-hour period, and it seems the only reason she was released is because a prosecutor reviewing old files noticed something didn't add up. Upon requesting an immediate update on the situation, Hoffman would be released. She has since filed a civil suit, but I could not speak on the outcome of that.
And finally, at number 1 is Jesse Pomeroy. Born in 1859, Jesse was a convicted murderer and the youngest person in Massachusetts to ever have been convicted of first-degree murder. He targeted boys, and so a lot of them ended up dead, as you can imagine if you've seen The Alienist. The bad guy in that was based off him. And I watched that, and that was messed up. He was pronounced guilty in 1874 and also sentenced to death, but the death warrant was never signed. The council voted several times to have Governor Gaston sign the warrant, but he never did, and so the death penalty was changed to him serving out his sentence in solitary confinement. In 1876, he was transferred to the state prison in Charleston, where he was sent to solitary at the age of 16. He apparently taught himself to read many languages in that time, like Hebrew. He wrote
wrote poetry, studied law, and tried to escape 10 to 12 times, so confinement was quite productive for Jesse. He even lost an eye after trying to destroy one side of his cell with a gas pipe. In 1917, he was finally allowed to join the rest of the jail and later died in 1932 from old age.
Starting off number 10, we have Sam Mendez. Sam Mendez was part of a landmark case decision for minors in solitary confinement that even brought the judge in the case to tears. Mendez was imprisoned after being convicted of killing a woman at the age of 14, even though no evidence tied him to the crime. At the time he was released, he was in prison for more than 23 years, most of it spent in solitary. He was put in solitary for incredibly small offenses, like making an unpermitted phone call and using a bathroom key when he wasn't supposed to. And literally, I do worse things on the daily. But in 2019, his sentence was reconsidered after a 2016 Supreme Court ruling declared life without parole for minors unconstitutional, which gave him the chance for his case to be reconsidered. After he was released, his mother was incredibly relieved, telling news outlets that the last time she had seen him was in 2004. And unfortunately, he left solitary battling a host of mental illnesses. In at number 9, Albert Woodfox. Albert Woodfox was held in solitary for 44 years in a Louisiana prison before being released in 2016, when he was 69 years old. And after being released, he decided to speak out about the torture he had endured while living in isolation, in a book he wrote called Solidarity: My Story of Transformation and Hope. In the book and many interviews he did after, he spoke of how the hardest day was when he learned he wouldn't be able to attend his mother's funeral. In the book he speaks of the severe bouts of claustrophobia he would endure, saying, quote, "The pain was so intense, it was so deep, I had never felt that kind of pain before. This was different from physical pain. My very soul ached," he said in an interview with The Current. In 1971, age 22, he was convicted of armed robbery and sentenced to 50 years in Angola prison, which is known for being one of the hardest prisons in America. Then in 1973, he was sent to Solidarity after being convicted for the murder of a prison guard. But in the book and in the interviews that followed, he maintained his innocence, saying that when the prison guard was found dead, him and another inmate were convicted, despite no physical evidence against them. With Woodfox believing his conviction was because he was a member of the Black Panthers and was trying to fix the prison system while he was inside. Up at number 8, Frank De Palma. Frank De Palma developed agoraphobia while he was in solitary confinement, which is a fear of going outside, and a preference for being locked in his tiny cell. After he was sentenced to prison for grand larceny, battery, second-degree murder, and attempted murder, he was sentenced to solitary when some new and young gang members were brought into the prison in an effort to separate them. And for the last 5 years of his sentence, he never once came out of his cell, saying in an interview that he would cherish the times when he would get to go outside to exercise. But one day he felt intense anxiety about being outside, and it didn't stop until he was back in his cell, saying that eventually just the thought of coming out of his cell for any reason would send him into a panic. And after that he was sent to the psych ward for 10 months because he had developed a serious mental illness, and he still struggles even though he has been released from prison. In at number 7, Steven Slevin. Steven Slevin was thrown in jail in 2005 after he got a DWI, then spent 2 years in solitary confinement. But after his terrible treatment while inside, he was actually awarded $15.5 million in one of the largest prisoner civil rights awards in US history. After Slevin was put in prison, he was almost immediately put in solitary, and there were months where he did not leave. He was given food and medication during these periods but wasn't bathing, resulting in mold forming on his skin and his teeth to rot. Ugh, I'm not gonna lie, I kinda got chills saying that one. Like, how can someone develop mold? Like, that's just so messed up. Then after he was released, he started a case for prisoner rights because of all the atrocities he had faced while inside. His lawyer spoke more about the case, saying they were able to prove that the prison was completely indifferent to the terrible conditions he faced. And with all the evidence they had against the prison, Slevin was awarded $22 million by a jury, but after some appeals, it was settled at $15.5 million. In at number 6, Adam Capay. Adam Capay is a First Nations man that was sent to solitary confinement in 2012 after he was charged with killing another inmate. But there were many cries for his release after he was subjected to 4 years in isolation, as well as 24/7 artificial light, with the minister in charge of Ontario prisons stating that back in 2016 he would not release him from solitary as that was the decision for the courts, not a politician. While awaiting trial, Capay served approximately 4.5 years in solitary confinement, and during his isolation, his lawyers argued these conditions constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The courts ended up agreeing, with a judge ruling that the violation of Capay's rights under the Canadian Charters of Rights and Freedoms outweighed the government charges. Capay was then released in January 29, 2019. Halfway through at number 5, Cesar Villa. Caesar Villa spoke about his awful time while in solitary in an essay he wrote back in 2013, while he was in his 12th year of isolation at the Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit, or SHU. Villa was originally placed in solitary indefinitely after being validated as a gang member. In an essay, he wrote how being in the SHU was a cold and empty world, where the emptiness would seep into your bones, saying in the first few weeks he tried to tell himself that he could get through it. But then as the weeks went on, things got worse. He was forced to sit outside in the cold during his time in solitary, and he would stand in his underwear in the yard while he was shivering from the rain and snow coming down on him, saying that at the end of his first year, his feet and hands began to split open from the cold, and that he bled all over his clothes, food, and even in his sheets. Even saying that the facility was so strict, band-aids weren't even allowed. Saying that he didn't realize it then, but in hindsight his psyche was unraveling. And oh my god, after hearing that honestly might be the worst one. Oh, that is just crazy. Then in at number 4, Sarah Jo Pender. Even though most people that end up in solitary are men, women are not immune from this treatment. Some are even sent to solitary as a retaliation for them exposing abuse inside the prison from staff. Sarah Jo Pender was sent to prison after being convicted of murder along with her boyfriend, but later was sent to solitary confinement after she escaped from prison in 2008, leading to her being featured on America's Most Wanted. After many years in solitary, she decided to write about her time while there, with her writing about how women would come in sane, but would leave completely shut down inside, or hurting themselves out of frustration, saying how she witnessed her prison mates making countless attempts on their own lives, with items they found around the prison. A book on her escape called Girl Wanted: The Chase for Sarah Pender was released back in 2011, but it was criticized for being pretty inaccurate. In at number 3, Ashley Smith, who unfortunately ended up passing away after she strangled herself in 2007. And a jury ended up deciding the fact that it was not a suicide, but rather a homicide, because of how neglected Smith was. And even more horribly, the prison guards witnessed the horrific event, with some even videotaping it, if you can believe it, because they were ordered to not go inside of her cell if she's still breathing, even though they could pretty clearly see what was going to happen if they didn't intervene. 2 years later, one of newly elected Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's first acts was to ask Cabinet to implement recommendations arising from the inquest into her treatment, with Smith's mother Coralie writing in the Globe and Mail in 2014 that her daughter's death would not be the last time solitary confinement would put Canadian inmates in harm's way, and that more needed to be done to stop all this. In at number 2, Reddit AMA. To spice up the list a bit, I wanted to include a Reddit AMA, where an anonymous user wrote that they were in solitary for 15 years, and said they would answer questions, with the user revealing that they were in prison because they tried to kill their stepfather, but they were put in solitary because of a gang affiliation, saying that after being released, they were able to lead somewhat of a normal life, with them now being employed as a taxi driver, but that they still struggle with PTSD from the experience and have a tendency to push others away to this day. Then if you were wondering what can be done while you're in solitary, they spoke of how they tried to keep their mind active by reading, writing, and listening to the radio. But since they were restricted for the most part while inside, meaning they were only able to read law books and a Bible, then ending off saying that the silence of lockdown is mind-numbing and suffocating, and with the only noises being heard is screaming, crying, or banging on cell doors. It drove them mentally insane. Then at number 1, Keith Lamar. Keith Lamar was locked up after he killed someone as a teenager in a dispute over drugs. A few years after, he was placed in solitary and then sentenced to death after he was convicted of killing 5 other inmates during the Lucasville uprising. He then spent 27 years in solitary confinement in a supermax prison in Ohio, isolated for 23 hours a day in a bathroom-sized room. And in all those years, he was not let outside whatsoever, and his only connection to the outside was a crack in the wall. But he's trying to change the rules in prison, as after a hunger strike in 2011 by him and some other inmates, him and others in the Ohio prison won the right to hug their family members during visits, instead of just seeing them through plexiglass, as well as being able to make phone calls. In light of the current pandemic, Lamar has been asked advice from his friends and family on how to cope with quarantine, with him telling Mother Jones that he's lucky to have a full bookshelf and a desk, but he also takes time to look inside himself by painting and doing yoga and meditation. Starting off this countdown, we have the Man in the Iron Mask. The Man in the Iron Mask is the name given to an unidentified prisoner arrested in 1669 or 1670. He was imprisoned during the reign of King Louis XIV of France. Now, what's so scary about this prisoner is how his identity was always kept unknown. He was forced to wear a mask that blocked off his face. Some say he wore a black velvet mask, while others reported that it was a full-on iron mask. Apparently, the guards were ordered to shoot this man if he ever removed the mask. On top of that, he was kept in solitary confinement with double doors. He spent the rest of his life there until he died on November 19th, 1703. Moving on to number 9, we have Jesse Pomeroy. Jesse Pomeroy, otherwise known as the Boston Boy Fiend or the Boy Torturer, was convicted of countless murders at the age of 14 in 1875. He would abuse, torture, and then kill his victims. In fact, he was the youngest person in the history of Massachusetts to be convicted of first-degree murder. When Jesse was caught, he admitted to the murders and was sentenced to live in the Westboro Boys Reform School until he was 18. However, while at the school, he went on to commit other murders. That's when he was sentenced to prison and was placed in solitary confinement. His only interactions were with his guard and his mom, who would visit him once a month. In our 8th spot, we have Ian Manuel. In 1990, when Ian Manuel was only 13 years old, he shot a woman in the face, blowing out part of her jaw during a robbery. Thankfully, she survived, but as a result of his crime, he was tried and convicted as an adult. As a result, he was sentenced to 65 years in prison. He was one of the youngest inmates in the Tampa State Penitentiary. Manuel spent 15 plus years in isolation, making him the longest serving inmate in solitary confinement in Florida. Eventually, he was released after the woman he shot actually fought for his freedom, claiming everyone does dumb things when they're young, and she didn't want him to waste his life in jail. In our 7th spot, we have Ian Brady. Between 1963 and 1965, Ian Brady and his accomplice tortured, abused, and killed 5 individuals. They would bury their bodies on the moors outside of Manchester, which gave them the name the Moors Murderers. The crimes they committed were horrific, and Brady expressed no remorse. As a result, he was held in solitary confinement. His only contact with the outside world was through letters. It's said that on his free time he would memorize whole pages of Shakespeare and Plato and then recite them to himself. He would also often interact with television programs. Brady died in prison on May 15, 2017 at the age of 79. Making our way down the list, number 6, we have Dennis Rader. Between the years of 1974 to 1991, American serial killer Dennis Rader took the lives of 10 individuals. In 2005, he was convicted for his crimes, and now he's facing 175 years in solitary confinement without the possibility of parole. Now, Dennis likes to go by the name BTK, or the BTK Strangler, which stands for bind him, torture him, and kill him. So that says a lot about who this guy is. But thankfully, he is locked away and has no chance of escaping. To this day, Dennis is considered one of the most diabolical serial killers in American history. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with John Massey. In 1975, John Massey got into a fight with a pub's bouncer and he shot him in the chest. At the age of 26, he was sentenced to life for murder. But while in prison, Massey managed to successfully escape 3 times. His most notorious escape was when he made a makeshift rope out of sheets and a pair of heavy-duty gloves to climb over the prison wall. As a result of his escapes, he was placed in solitary confinement. He was allowed 15 minutes outside of his cell each day, and had only 8 minutes for a phone call. Other than that, he was kept locked away. He is considered one of Britain's longest serving prisoners. He was eventually released after spending nearly 43 years behind bars. In our 4th spot, we have Thomas Silverstein. Thomas Edward Silverstein was an American criminal jailed for armed robbery in 1978. But while in prison, he committed numerous other crimes. In 1983, he killed a prison officer who he stabbed multiple times. Then he murdered 2 inmates. As a result, he had to be detained in a specially designed cell at the ADX Florence Federal Penitentiary in Colorado. Due to the crimes he committed while in jail, he is considered the most violent prisoner in America. He is also referred to as America's most isolated man. Now, Silverstein was considered so dangerous that he got transferred to a federal prison in Atlanta. There he was confined in a 6 by 7 foot cell. He was constantly under surveillance. In fact, the lights in his cell were never turned off so that they could always keep an eye on him. Silverstein eventually died in prison at the age of 67. He is said to have served the longest term in solitary confinement in the federal penitentiary system. Coming in at number 3, we have Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos, often referred to as the Damsel of Death, was found guilty of killing 7 men. She claimed it was self-defense, but then later pleaded guilty to the murders. She would murder them, rob them, and then drive home in their cars. Due to this, she was named America's first female serial killer. Now, Eileen was placed in solitary confinement for quite some time, but then she started to grow paranoid. She thought that the people making her food were spitting in it, and then she also claimed that she was being attacked by a sonic weapon. As a result, she wanted the court to hurry up with her death sentence. On October 9, 2002, Eileen died by lethal injection. Moving on to number 2, we have Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory, otherwise known as the Countess who bathed in blood, was a serial killer in Hungary back in the 16th century. It's believed that she had killed around 650 girls. She's also considered the most vicious female serial killer in all recorded history. It's believed that her husband was a big influence in her killings. Apparently, he told her to torture her servants. He said for her to pour honey all over them and then let the bugs eat them. But her killings didn't truly start until she met a witch named Anna Darvula. This witch told Elizabeth that bathing in the blood of the young would help her maintain her youth. And that's exactly what she would do. Eventually, Elizabeth was sentenced to life in solitary confinement. She was locked up in her castle's torture chamber. The windows and doors were boarded up with her inside. There was only a small hole in which food was passed in through. On August 21st, 1611, she passed away. And in our number 1 spot, we have Robert Maudsley. Now, I've talked about Robert in my other video on dangerous criminals, and there's no way that I couldn't include him on this list. Robert Maudsley is considered Britain's most dangerous prisoner. Maudsley was originally convicted for 1 murder, however killed 3 more individuals in prison, which got him placed in solitary confinement. In 1977, Maudsley and his fellow inmate held another prisoner hostage. They ended up torturing him for 9 hours before cracking his head open and killing him. Now, it's rumored that he may have ate some of that prisoner's brain. As a result, he was deemed the real-life Hannibal Lecter. After that, he murdered 2 more inmates, which got him placed in solitary confinement. In fact, he is locked up in a glass cell underneath Wakefield Jail. He spends 23 hours of his day there.